Jeff Wasserstrom, who's Chancellor's professor of history at UC Irvine, author of many, many books, a great public intellectual, a major figure in the publishing world in Asian stuff, and so on and so forth, and a hail fellow, well met, very charming speaker. I'm sure you're going to enjoy Jeff's presentation on China and globalization.
It's a real treat to be here. I love speaking to groups of teachers, one of my favorite groups to speak to. Love being introduced by a former member of my dissertation committee, from whom I learned a lot, when he was one of the really cool young professors at Berkeley. When I was there, like being back in Northern California. I have spent a good part of my life either in Southern California or in Northern California. I was born right near here, actually, in the Stanford Hospital, back when it was the new Stanford Hospital. Now it's a quite old one. And went to Santa Cruz before I went to Berkeley, now teach at Irvine, grew up a brat around UCLA, so I'm really a product of California, though I spent 15 years in Indiana in the middle, and that it made me appreciate coming back here. I do want to talk a little bit about the American presidential election. I won't talk too much about it. I do have a piece just up on the Huffington Post that you've been hearing a lot about Trump and Putin and possible ties and why they might like each other and all that. And I offer there 5 reasons why I could imagine Xi Jinping smiling while he was watching the Republican National Convention in different things that Trump was saying, including, and I think this will tie into something that I'm going to, I want you to keep in your mind about globalization, is we often think erroneously of it meaning a flow of one set of values around the world, but actually globalization can move in different directions. And even though Trump and some others have been talking about pushing back against globalization, they've had a kind of nationalistic rhetoric about putting their nation first. That itself is part of a cultural globalization phenomenon in which that variety of nationalism is flowing in different places. So in some ways, you can think about styles of leadership. He's talking about a one man who can do everything kind of thing. He presents himself as being potentially the chairman of everything, which is one of the things that Tom said is a nickname for Xi Jinping. I think Jeremy Barmay, a very witty Australian China specialist, came up with it first. And he said, look, Xi Jinping has so many titles, let's just call him chairman of everything. But since then, he's added yet another title, commander-in-chief. First, it was president, now it's commander-in-chief. So what is that? That's a flow of an American style term toward China, but the flow, the idea of this one man can fix all is either a throwback to earlier, or both a throwback to some earlier ideas about rule, but also a flow across borders of certain kinds of ideas of a kind of strongman leader. These are dangerous times, chaotic times. You need somebody firm in control. So that is something about globalizing flows. And so one of the things I want you to keep in mind, several things. Tom has covered so much ground of things that I was going to bring up that I'm going to try to do this in a very rapid fire way, focusing on constructs to use to think about going over many of the things to complement many of the things that Tom said, but I won't have to fill in the history. It's kind of funny. Tom's the sociologist, I'm the historian. He gave the historical talk, and I'm going to be more of the kind of social scientist model building, but I love that kind of thing. So here are just the few things that are takeaways, and I'm going to shamelessly plug some books. I don't have to shamelessly plug this one because you're already familiar with it, though I will draw on the cover a little bit. A new edition is in the works for 2017 with a co-author, Mara Cunningham, and it has to have new questions and new answers, so I'm looking forward to your questions and my efforts at answers. But I do have this I used to call this my shortest book, my cheapest book, and my most recent book. Now this one's even shorter and maybe even cheaper in some settings, though it's overpriced in America. It's cheap other places. But it's coming out in September. And it's a quirky set of 8 little imperfect analogy-based chapters. Each has a comparison in it that I say at the outset isn't perfect. You can shoot holes in it. But I think just thinking about this comparison that you haven't routinely been thinking about, that isn't the normal way that something is phrased often in the press or in public discourse, at least in some places, is a way of getting you out of a box of thinking in certain ways about China. And I think imperfect analogies, it's not a matter of finding just the right fit, but is there something about the fit between two things that aren't often compared that can break you out of a trap you fall into? And in China in the 21st century, I use it as an example of that. Not that these are perfect, not that this is a perfect equivalence, morally or otherwise, but that when it seems baffling how Han Chinese view Tibet in such a radically different way than we do in this country, and how it's so hard to imagine why anybody would think it was strange, if you were Han Chinese, that world leaders are meeting with the Dalai Lama, who we think of as a kind of modern figure, cosmopolitan figure, and revered figure, and in China he's viewed very differently. I use the analogy of Tibet being like mainland China's Hawaii, a thing that a lot of Americans think of going to Hawaii as going to a beautiful place to observe nature, but they think of it and have a good holiday, and maybe they have some admiration for the culture there of people who are more in touch with the earth and certain ways of thinking. But if you said to them, so the descendant of the king of Hawaii should get control of that territory again, you say, no, that would be a throwback to the past, and look at how much in Hawaii wasn't even there until it became part of America. And a lot of mainland Americans sort of forget that Hawaii ever was completely separate. All of that maps on to how a lot of Han Chinese think about Tibet. And I don't say that's perfect. I don't think they're morally, I still admire the Dalai Lama, but I think that gets you out of a box of incomprehensibility. And I think there are other things like that. So here are a couple of related to globalization and China and the US relations to China to keep in your mind. One imperfect analogy that can be very useful is to think about China now as being comparable to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, when we were the rapidly rising power that was making the previous setters of the global agenda nervous and wondering if we would completely rock things up, or if we would become part of the global system and perhaps change it some, which is, I think, what happened. That's not perfect. There are differences, but I think there are a lot of parallels. Keep those in the back of your mind. You'll see when I'm bringing things up. Another parallel to keep in mind that isn't perfect is that a lot of the anxieties about China now are like anxieties that we've had about Japan in the past. And there's been a ebb and flow between a sort of trading places of China and Japan in the American imagination. Sometimes it's thought of as a seesaw effect. We seem to only be able to admire and fear one of them at a time. So at moments when we're excited about China's possibilities, we're anxious about Japan, and vice versa. Keep that in mind. It's not always that way, but there's a little bit of that going on. So those are two things related to globalization and with US-China relations. The other thing just to keep in mind about that is another theme I bring up in this 8 Juxtapositions book, is that often if you're forced to choose between two ways of thinking about something, it's often useful to say, is there a third? And I think with globalization, is crucial to make space in your mind for a third, particularly about China. And I'll give a concrete example about that. But basically, it's that there's one idea is that globalization would mean the complete, somehow, Americanization of China. That's not going to happen. Another is that China's integration into the global order is going to mean the complete sinification of the global order. And that's not going to happen either. But I think some people would like you to imagine that those are two outcomes. Neither makes sense, actually, if you really look at it. What's going to happen is China's going to rise. It's going to affect some elements of the global order, and it's going to adapt in some ways to that global order. And we'll end up with something different than we had before China's rise, but it won't be China ruling the world, nor will it be China being Americanized. So that's sort of a quick tour of the themes I'm going to bring up. And I want to begin by using something to illustrate that just from the cover of this book. So I first went to China almost exactly 30 years ago. I left in August of 1986, and I arrived in China. In some ways, everything I've written about China since, when I write about the present, is in part working through an idea, as I think a lot of us do. How has China changed or not changed since I first went there? And how can we explain that change or not change? And this book cover was meant to draw attention to a clear conundrum about that. The picture on the top that was taken early in 21st century, not by me, of a punk rock concert in Beijing, the fans there. Now, in 1986, there was nothing like that took place. That scene was not something that happened. There was one rock concert in China in 1986, the first one then. It was Jan and Dean, an old beach rock group that went. And there was actually, it happily partly spurred some of the protests of that year because students went. They were excited about going to a rock concert, their first one. They got up to dance, and security guards made them sit down. And when they were protesting about democracy and about freedom, this was the Tiananmen generation and the warm-up to Tiananmen, they said that symbolized for them what was wrong, I can't think of any other way to say it, half-assed about the approach to international opening to the world that was going on. You can have a rock concert, but you can't dance. And in some ways at Tiananmen Square, where rock music was quite important, along with calls for democracy and other things, it was about this desire to have the full package of being able to act like kids in other parts of the world, as well as political things. So in some ways, post-'89, kids got that part of it. The next generation got to go to rock concerts and to dance. And so something dramatic changed in China from the 80s to the 90s and 21st century, a lot of growth in personal freedoms, a lot of more integration with international youth culture and popular culture, but something stayed the same. And if you look there, the bottom picture, which showed the members of the China's elite, still almost all male, all clapping in unison, at something, that was something that didn't change, was the political source. So it's balancing those two kinds of things. And I've thought a lot about those kinds of what's changed, how much culture and other things have changed, but how much certain kinds of things about the political structure haven't changed. But one of the things that I'm going to focus on about this right now is two things. One is that when I started giving talks about the cover, people started to say, I started realizing there were some things that the top and bottom picture, while a study in contrast, have in common. All male in both cases, a kind of male dominance of a public sphere. A lot of red in both pictures, something about festivity going along as well as politics going along with the color red. And the fact that everybody in the picture dyes their hair for different pictures. And they dye their hair in part for conformist things, even though the punks are saying we're nonconformists, we're all dyeing our hair. But anyway, they're conforming. But on the bottom, they're dyeing their hair in part because the Communist Party says it's handing power off to a younger and younger generation, but it's actually pretty old men at most of the time, so that jet black hair. Anyway, and we were anxious when this edition was about to go into press. We worried, like, could we still use this? This picture was from the 2010 edition, or would the new standing committee that was about to be announced, would one of them have gray hair? That would ruin the joke anyway, and luckily, or unluckily, there was no change there. But one of the other things about it, if you really look at them, there's actually something that had changed from the 1980s, and certainly from the 1970s about this, which is one part of what they're doing at the bottom. That's not a picture of a Mao-era ruling group because of what they're wearing. I was glad that Tom brought attention to the clothing. They're now all dressed all like you would find Japanese or American men dressing in powerful positions. And also another thing that changed that relates to this kind of forms changing even, or style converging with globalization, even when not everything does converge, is that now China's leaders are called president, usually. In the earlier period, even in the 1980s, that was not a common term. So there's been, I think this is the biggest thing about what globalization really means, convergence and integration, but not homogenization. Uniformity in the sense of a shared uniform or shared patterns and symbols, but still radical difference in the content of specific things going on. And there's one great example that I don't have. I have some fun visuals that I'll get to in a second, but one that I don't have visuals for is if you went back to the 1800s and said, how do countries represent themselves to one another? What's the icon for a country? When, if you're saying this stands for my country, people would have all kinds of different kinds of objects or banners or things that would stand for it. In the 19th century, when there was a burst of globalization into this mutual recognizability of things that were called nation states that had to be sort of like one another, every country that became part of that system, by now every country in the world has a piece of cloth of basically the same rectangular shape that is a flag. And yet every flag has to be different or the structure doesn't work. So there has to be integration or uniformity, but there can't be homogenization or the structure doesn't work. So that's the biggest kind of takeaway. So some examples of this, one of the things that's going on, something in the news, and this, I'm glad a question was asked about education, and I've spent a little time at NYU Shanghai, and it's an example of an effort to try to create something in China that replicates to some degree what goes on in an American institution. And it has some things that are immediately recognizable as sharing these globally circulating forms, even though it's not quite like an American university. So for example, it has a university store where you can buy logos and t-shirts and a variety of things, and Chinese universities are moving to having things more like this as well. There's also, this is the University of Nottingham, an earlier effort at this kind of replica of something from someplace else. It's the University of Nottingham in Ningbo, not far from Shanghai, that it even has a replica of the clock tower there. And I've been obsessed with clock towers because there was a famous clock tower in Shanghai, which I used to study Shanghai during its treaty port period that Tom introduced, that I don't have to I don't have to go over. But one of the real icons of that was this clock tower that was just like a British clock tower. It was called Big Cheng because it was like Big Ben. And it had Westminster chimes brought over. But as Tom also said, those places were seen as there was a kind of Western forms came there, but on the West's terms. Now, this is something that imports a style of a British clock tower to there, but it's part of a branch of the University of Nottingham that was set up on Chinese terms to have something there. So it's a great illustration, again, of something he talked about, of these different kinds of opening in which China has or hasn't had control over what's going on. This is just an example of how there's often a kind of localization, no matter how globally or even Americanized what seems like Americanization. There's an M&M store there, but it's also an M&M store where something that tells you you're in China. And Shanghai Disneyland, which I haven't been to yet, it's driving me crazy because I'd love to be there. But it has the discussions of it that I've seen. It has varieties of ways in which it is both a replica of the American thing, and there are some things that tell you you're not in America, like the Monkey King being integrated into the performance of the Lion King there. All right. I only try to pick on people who are more famous and have much higher book sales than me, so Thomas Friedman is good. This is wrong. This is how you should not teach about globalization. This phenomenon we call globalization is actually a very American phenomenon. It wears Mickey Mouse ears, eats Big Macs, tracks its investments with Merrill Lynch using Windows 95. Countries that plug into globalization are really plugging into a high degree of Americanization. And he's pretty much kept that line, even though he updates some of the references. So Windows 95 is out, so he has different things. This is wrong. This is an idea I call Friedman flattening, which is just not what happens. It does not smooth out. And I think it's interesting. Now there's more of a pushback against this. I mean, again, sorry to bring up Trump again, but he says he has to push against globalization in order to assert America being great. Whereas this took the presumption that the more globalized the world became, the greater America would become. So we're in a different period. It used to be that the critics of globalization were more often on the left, pushing back against capitalism. Now often the critics of globalization are on the right, pushing for a kind of nationalism. All right, so this is the Friedman fallacy turned into a visual representation. And it's just all wrong. And I'll talk about some ways that it's wrong, and particularly wrong for China. Beginning with the Big Mac. A Big Mac is a Big Mac is a Big Mac is what, and McDonald's means that American things are coming places. There's a great book, Golden Arches East, that talks about what actually happened in the lived experience when McDonald's went to Asia. It arrived in Asia, and all the localized meanings they took on. That a Big Mac meant something very different in Taiwan than it did in Beijing and in different places than that. A Big Mac, eating a Big Mac in China in the 1990s meant showing how cosmopolitan and enlightened you were. You were part of modernity, whereas often eating a Big Mac in America at the same time meant you were not being cosmopolitan. To be cosmopolitan, you'd go out for ethnic food, but this was almost seen as ethnic food in there. It was also seen as a classy place to go on a date, because if you're a college student there, you know, you wanted to show like you would be taking somebody to a French restaurant and maybe on a date in America. So all these ways, a Big Mac isn't a Big Mac. Always. So that's one way, is that globalization means homogenization, Americanization. But another view that's out there is that China will either control the next form of the world, this kind of when China rules the world, if China becomes part of the global order, it will dominate it and enforce everything, or China somehow stands so apart and unique that it will never kind of be integrated. And those are also wrong. This idea of China being so exceptional that it'll either dominate the world or it'll keep its own thing. So while Friedman was talking about integration, people like Huntington were talking about the clash of civilizations, these irreconcilable areas. And then there was also the Kissinger confusion. I like alliteration, as you may see, where he thought the singularity of China, it's such a singular place, and it's totally going to go its own way, no matter what. No matter what it seems to be integrating, it won't really. And that, I think, is also wrong in a variety of ways. And here, sorry, but this is like the only China specialist who's come out in favor of Trump, Peter Navarro, and he's at UC Irvine, and I think he's really wrong. I used to hold up a book that he wrote called The Coming China Wars and say, this is how not to think about China. It's hyperbolic. Look at that title. What title could be worse than The Coming China Wars? Then he came up with Death by China. So, yes. So this is also an idea of China, if it becomes integrated, will take over the world, versus China, if it becomes integrated, will become just like us. I think they're both wrong. I think when the Olympics took place, ironically, both of these things got a burst. The idea of Americanization, China is part of the world, the Olympics will democratize it. South Korea had the Olympics, and then it democratized. Maybe that'll happen with China. But then there was also the idea that China, there were fears about China. The sort of China is being integrated, images from the Olympics would show you things like Yao Ming and touting Big Macs. The fear of China ones came, this was an episode of South Park that imagined a Chinese invasion by these militarized side of that opening ceremony. And Eric Cartman, one of the characters in it, is screaming in the night, and his mother comes and knocks on the door and says, "Eric, sweetie, are you having nightmares about the Chinese again?" And I like that again, because there are periods in the past when we've had these kinds of fears. Globalization isn't new. This is just a quote from Marx and Engels, talking about how integrated the world's become, what's going to happen. There have been periods, bursts of globalization, where China has often been imagined as either becoming part of the game or standing apart. My favorite way to think about globalization is in this book, The Birth of the Modern World. It's a tough read. It's not something you can use in your classroom, but I have not found anything better as a sophisticated but accessible read on how globalization works. And the example, and this is where this idea of uniformity and shared patterns but not shared content on all matters, I think, is great. And he uses as an example not flags but clothing. He says in the late 18th century, if you went around the world, the most powerful men in the world dressed in totally different ways. From elaborate dress and costuming in some European monarchs to ritual undress in the South Seas. By the early 20th century, powerful men around the world could look at each other and recognize each other by the clothing they wore. When China and when the first former president, Ulysses S. Grant, met with a very powerful Chinese person, Li Hongzhang, in the mid-19th century, China was not part of that globalization move, and one marker of it was that Ulysses S. Grant was dressing like a lot of the powerful men around the world. Li Hongzhang was seen from a different world. Japan, meanwhile, was becoming part of that globalizing form, and you could see that in part by an image of the Japanese had created a constitution, had a parliament. It wasn't just on dress, but dress went along with these moves toward the global norms. China was still set apart from that during the Boxer Uprising in 1900, which I can't even start talking about because I won't stop talking about it. It's the subject of my next book. China was seen as irreconcilably different, not only dressed different, but not even sort of fully human in that, pushing back. Japan, meanwhile, was part of the invading force that suppressed the Boxers, one of the ones who were helping to slice up the melon. And the Japanese, this is another example of globalization at that point. All of these are armies from different parts of the world wearing uniforms that are different but somehow parallel, flags that are different but are parallel. And China's outside of this. China's outside of it, still ruled by an empress, still dressed differently. I can talk about how women's clothing tells a different story but a related one. After the revolution, not only did China establish a republic as opposed to a monarchy, but it began to have a leader who dressed and dressed more like a Western leader and was called a president. Short-lived, but that possibility was there. Though he also then established a different form of dress, which was the Mao suit. Before it was a Mao suit, was the Sun Zhongshan suit. And then this idea of a convergence idea, and the clothing, China's becoming part of the system, led to this American fantasy of complete Americanization and parallels, and Sun Yat-sen saw some parallels between himself and Lincoln. You have this move toward globalization, which also reflects itself in women's clothing. Here, the most powerful women in China by World War II are dressing in distinctive ways, but something that parallels each other with the furs and with the elegance and their comparable roles as kind of first wives who were partners. Japan, meanwhile, the story is Japan is not becoming part of is sort of pushing against global norms. China is getting more and more into this. So here's a picture of the Bretton Woods negotiations where China is going to be part of the post-World War II order, seems to be integrated into this, seems to be part of the group setting the rules. But then there's the divergence from that, the breaking away from this under Mao, which goes along with clothing things. Meanwhile, Japan, remember Japan up, Japan down, China down, but also one is really integrating, learning our lessons, the other is not learning our lessons. Japan is now under control that seems in sartorially as well as other things marked as converging with our ways, which make us happy. By the early 1970s, Mao and Nixon meet. Again, they seem to be coming from different worlds. They're called different titles. They're wearing different clothes. Deng Xiaoping, there's a move toward China integrating. And this is right when we start fearing Japan, remember, in the 1980s. And here Deng Xiaoping is in America, but he's still wearing a Mao suit. He doesn't look like the American leaders. But the most famous photo op from that is when he puts on a cowboy hat, which is sort of like, maybe we can get a sense, and Americans love this, maybe going down the line, they actually are moving into this storyline again. Meanwhile, Japan, the people don't change their dress. When Japan is being feared, they're presented as wearing this weird, outlandish clothing that is separating itself apart. By the time that Jiang Zemin meets this guy, he hasn't been in the news for about 2 decades, so you might not recognize him. That's Bill Clinton. So anyway, he meets with Jiang Zemin, and by this time, they're dressed identically, and they're both being called president. This is the first time that this kind of parallel things comes in there. And you see this representation of the move from Mao to Deng Xiaoping to Jiang Zemin representing that kind of move. I just love this photo. I can't. But there's also something that within globalization, one thing that happens is nations never go away as significant markers, but there are often new configurations of regions within the world. So even within globalization, you have not just nations retain their separateness, but configurations retain their separateness, like NATO becomes something. This is at the APEC summits. There are groups of Pacific nations that all get together and say, we are different nations, but we are part of the same team. So on most days, they wear their standard clothing, but on the last day, they all dress in the clothing of the host country. And this, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, was what what China chose when these were held in Shanghai. It's just a great picture. Xi Jinping and Obama met in Sunnylands, and this, I think, showed the U.S.-China relation was trying to move to a new stage of really being being able to work together on more things, even though, remember, they're very different. They're called president, but Xi Jinping's power really derives from heading a party. He doesn't stand for election, and all things like that. But here they were shown they not only dressed alike when they were working, but they shared this uniform of people getting down to business and talking to each other. And they showed talking to each other, walking around. They don't speak the same languages, so I'm not sure. And there's no interpreter. Their daughters, interestingly, could speak. in either Chinese or English, perhaps at least, because Obama's children were learning Chinese for a while and Xi Jinping's daughter went to Harvard. But they're not the ones walking and talking. Another image I can't resist, which is just the Chinese internet had fun with this. You can't directly criticize, but you can have fun. And anybody who thinks China isn't a place with a lot of creativity waiting to be unleashed doesn't spend time on the Chinese internet. And I will just move to the very end. This is Xi Jinping meeting Abe. This is just an idea that now we're in a period where in certain ways, even if old lingering tensions are still there, in some ways there is meeting in a common symbolic terrain. And once again, because they look so unhappy there, the Chinese internet had some fun with that. More APEC things. And here, a plug finally for the last book, which isn't out yet. It's a coffee table book that I edited that ends with a chapter by Ian Johnson that is available at The Guardian as a long read online for free, which is about the presence of the past in contemporary China, that I think is just a perfect read to go along and complement with the things that Tom began with. And that's the picture of 8 Juxtapositions, which I plugged earlier, which has a lovely image that Penguin came up with, not me, which is of the penguin icon of the little penguin trapped between the Berlin Wall and Tiananmen Square. And one of the things that I'll just leave you with this provocation, because it's one of the things I say that usually, so Tiananmen and Berlin Wall, 1989 in Eastern Europe and 1989 in China are often paired together, but I think sometimes they're paired together the wrong way. They're paired together as if the fall of the Berlin Wall made it inevitable that China would soon get the end of history, Leninist extinction memo, and the Communist Party would fall. But I think actually the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, may have extended the life of the Chinese Communist Party because it told them that something had to change dramatically or their days were numbered. And they chose to offer people more and more choices in every place except political debates and political choices to see what would happen. What if you gave people lots and lots of choices of what to watch on television to stay distracted, what to buy at the supermarket, and you didn't give them other choices? That had never been tried in the Communist Party run world before, and it was tried, and it seems to have extended the life of the Chinese Communist Party. So thanks for your attention. I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Jeff. And now questions? Questions?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Bevel. I'm from Lowell High School, and I'm kind of fascinated with the impact of consumerism and what that's having on the political structure. I mean, what you just said sort of, I would think it would be a threat, but in some ways it's also kind of, an illusion and a dream that can take away from challenges to the political structure, but it seems like that's happening so fast. I'm curious to what extent the political leaders have a grip on that. And then it just seems that every time I've talked to people from China, they speak about the fact of, that the sort of modernization and, the economy is not reaching everybody and there's a divide and there's frustration about that. So I'm just curious about how the leadership is dealing with that issue.
That's a great question. Yeah, consumerism, I think, is the opiate of the masses in many ways, and having different things that you want. And also so China, I think, has succeeded in that. After the Berlin Wall fell, some people from Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany, the first place they went was to a department store to see if what they'd heard about all these choices there was possible. And one reason why communism fell in Eastern Europe was people in the West they knew had better stuff. And China, the Communist Party said, we can't let that kind of contrast with Taiwan or we need to do something about that. And so I think consumerism has been a key part of extending the run. Another thing that was key to extending the run was giving people, to go back to kind of Reagan's question, are you living better than you were 10 years ago, or whatever his version was. People needed to be able to answer that. And by the early 21st century, if I asked people in China, are you living better than your parents or grandparents, people say, that's a stupid question, at least in cities. This is the best. I heard people say this is the best time in history to have been born Chinese. It's night and day difference. And what they thought about in part was there was less of a kind of intrusive state, But it was more, I think, about this kind of more private life options, and not just about consuming, but also how to spend leisure time, another form of consumption then. So now I think there are two kinds of problems going on. One, and I'll leave it to the economists to talk about it much more, these are the people I read on these issues, so I don't want to say it. But one of the things is, there was the idea there that if you hadn't been swept up, raised yourself up during this reform period, your turn would come next. And one of the things about high growth rates, even for people being left behind, was this illusion that it was their turn next. So I think one of the problems now is people feeling it's never going to be their turn. And I think the Communist Party, in part because of that, in part because of other things, has kind of tweaked the story it's telling about, they're putting more and more emphasis on the idea that it's the best time in history to be born, in recent history, born Chinese, because look how strong the Chinese nation is, rather than respected in the world and its reach and all of that, and less emphasis on the best time to be because more and more stuff. And there also, I think, the appeal to pulling in traditional values that began with Hu Jintao is also another way of tweaking the narrative. Every regime, every government has to legitimate itself by telling a story about what they're doing, and there are different ways to tell that story. You can tell the story, and we're seeing it right now in the presidential election. There's a story of saying, look how things are getting better and better under our watch, which is the Democrats' story. And the other is, look at how far we've fallen and how we've been humiliated and we need to make ourselves great again. I meant to say something about the American dream and Chinese dream with globalization. That's a good example of global fashion that does not mean the same integration. The Chinese dream and the way in which it's being promoted connects to the American dream, and Xi Jinping says every country has their own dream, but the American dream is something that you can say, for the American dream to be realized, the state should get out of the way. The Chinese dream is, for the Chinese dream to be realized, that goes hand in hand with a strong state doing things. So in many ways, I wrote a piece about a year ago for Time about the irreconcilability of the Chinese dream and the American dream. But I just saw a tweet by the LA Times China reporter who said that her Chinese teacher, her Chinese tutor, was listening to Trump's speech about Make America Great Again and said, that sounds just like the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. So there too, that's a kind of way to play with similarities and differences and comparisons. There is a comparison between analogy and connection between the dreams, but there are also radical differences there.
Dr. Wasserstrom, thanks for your talk. It sets up some of our conversations we're going to have in the breakout, especially your reference to your Time magazine article is something I'll use in particular. Cool. I was going to send the conversation in a little different direction though for a second. Your students at Irvine, where are they coming in at the conversation about China? I'll warn you, I'm sending 2 of my seniors to Irvine in the fall. I'm wondering in general, what kind of job are we doing? And then as a counterpart to that, Dr. Gold mentioned earlier the number of Chinese students coming here on exchange. What's your take on the impact that has, especially when they go back?
It's enormous these are giant questions, and actually I will say David Wertheim, Foreign Policy, has been doing a wonderful job of running a whole series of things about Chinese students in America, in part trying to get beyond the idea that there's a single experience. I think things go in all kinds of directions, and it's an enormous thing. There are the numbers of Chinese students from China on an American university campus used to be in 2 digits, or if there were a lot of Chinese students, 3 digits, and now it's 4 digits at the big public universities, including Irvine. We're talking thousands in some cases. It's very large. And all kinds of things happen. Some go back to China with their minds open to critical thinking and with a lot of admiration for the United States and a wish that China would do some things more like they're done here. Others go back feeling alienated or sort of feeling that more nationalistic than they ever were before. It can go in all kinds of directions. And I think one thing that does that is the different ways in which media are imagined in the different places. I mentioned this in the book, that if you're sort of flipping the channels in America and you come across occasional things on TV that these sort of rabidly racist anti-Chinese statements, if you've grown up in a media environment where if something's on TV, at some level it means that's the government's view, you'll go home with the propaganda that you've heard about America being determined to keep China down reinforced rather than challenged. So I think there's a double thing going on. A lot of the education is trying to provide students from China with new ways of thinking about the world, but ironically, some of the things going on in America reinforce some of the propaganda lines they've been read about America, including the idea America is a very dangerous place in which guns are an enormous problem. I mean, much of this is actually happening here, and so it can be magnified and go back. So it's a challenge there. It's very interesting to have students in discussions both from China and not from China in the same class, but also from China, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, who bring all of that. So there's a very diversified thing, but it's a fascinating moment, and I would encourage you to look at the foreign policy series on this.